Good morning, everybody. We're live at State Fair Community College in my classroom. So today in anatomy, we did blood vessels and arteries and veins. Here in this class, we're going to talk about vinegar. So it's a nice kind of blustery, rainy, back to a cold day. It's about 48 degrees. So coats are in abundance once again. So I mentioned an hour or so ago that there was a guy that I knew um, that thought the answer to everything regarding your health was apple cider vinegar. Well, if you've ever tried to drink apple cider vinegar, it's kind of difficult and it'll be hard on your stomach. But you can certainly use vinegar and oil in your salads or apple cider vinegar in recipes, etc. And it seems to do some interesting things. So dilute vinegar has been around for a long time as like a folklore tonic for weight loss. So the first mention of that is all the way back in 1825 when a guy wrote about the dangers of vinegar. And then the poet Lord Byron had popularized vinegar for weight loss and apparently would go for days eating just biscuits and potatoes that were soaked in vinegar. Okay, so popular ways to use vinegar back then was to take several teaspoons prior to a meal or drinking it in a diluted water at bedtime. And I told you I knew a lady in Humansville, Missouri, 104, and this was 20 years ago. And I asked her, I said, what's your secret to being 104? And she looked 104, but she was still getting around. She looked reasonably healthy. And her combination, I've got to come up with the fourth part of her recipe, but it was equal parts, 4 parts, equal parts vinegar with grape juice, vodka, and one other thing that I just cannot remember for some reason. And she would drink equal 4 parts of these four things every day. And I said, how long have you been doing that? And she said, oh, since I was in my late 20s. So every day she had that little concoction. So apple cider vinegar has a particular following as it contains both vinegar, which is acetic acid, as well as the pectins from apple cider. So it's a soluble fiber. Okay, so does it help? So it's been used since the ancient times, really. If you leave wine undisturbed, it turns into vinegar or acetic acid. And the word is from the Latin for vinum acer, which means sour wine. And so they discovered way back when the versatility of this substance for cleaning. Okay, and so a time before antibiotics were developed, the antimicrobial properties of vinegar was used by healers. You can also get antiviral and antibacterial properties from hydrogen peroxide. So I run around spraying hydrogen peroxide in the kitchen cabinets several times a day because it's antiviral, it's inexpensive, it's antiviral and antibacterial. So again, back in the healer days, wounds would be washed in wine and vinegar because of the antimicrobial properties. Okay, it's also been used in pickling and to preserve food. So vinegar is used in pickling, right? Sauerkraut and kimchi, on the other hand, use fermentation to produce lactic acid, which is a little bit different process. Okay, so as a beverage, if you're drinking vinegar, that's never going to, except that 104-year-old lady, she did it every day. So it's never been popular to drink vinegar, although historically, apparently Cleopatra was famous for dissolving pearls in vinegar as a drink. Okay, it still has fans for sprinkling on French fries or using them in balsamic vinegar and dressings and making sushi rice or rice vinegar. So there's no long-term data on the use of vinegar for weight loss per se, but there's little short-term studies that have been done. One back in 2004 was vinegar improves insulin sensitivity to a high carbohydrate meal in subjects with insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes. So vinegar was given to insulin resistant as well as normal subjects before a high carbohydrate meal of orange juice and a bagel in that study. So the effect of vinegar in this study was fairly clear. In controls, but more strikingly in pre-diabetic people, vinegar lowered the subsequent glucose elevation after bread as much and orange juice as much as 34%. And then the insulin spikes that were recorded were reduced in those that ingested vinegar prior to that high carbohydrate meal. And so since insulin is a driver for diabetes, weight gain, and obesity, this effect, similar to fiber, when you eat fiber in your diet, may be beneficial over the long term. And then a follow-up study in 2010 entitled Examination of the Anti-Glycemic Properties of Vinegar in Healthy Adults looked in more detail at that effect. So 2 different doses were examined, and it was found that 10 grams or 2 teaspoons was just as effective as 20 grams or 4 teaspoons. And taking vinegar just before the meal was more effective than taking it 4 or 5 hours before a meal. So the effect also has been shown with rice. So in this study, glycemic index of single and mixed meal foods among common Japanese foods with white rice as a reference of food, the authors found that vinegar lowered the glycemic index of white rice by 40%. And then addition of other foods such as pickled vegetables and fermented soybeans lowered the glycemic index of the rice in a similar manner, as well as substitution of pickled cucumber for fresh cucumber also reduced the glycemic index of meals by about 35%, so about a third. And then potatoes, typically a high glycemic, high insulin index food, if they're served cold and dressed with vinegar as a salad, that reduced the glycemic index of potatoes. So regular potatoes have about a 90, I think 6% glycemic index, similar insulin index. And it may be that the cold storage of potatoes favors the development of a resistant starch, and then the vinegar adds more benefits to that. So the insulin and glycemic index were reduced by 31% and 43% respectively in that study. Another study, vinegar ingestion at bedtime moderates waking glucose concentrations, looked at the benefits of blood sugars after vinegar ingestion. So the participants in this study were type 2 diabetic patients that were not on insulin. And they were given 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar at bedtime, and morning blood sugars were measured. And so there was a measurable effect to lower morning or fasting blood sugars in those type 2 diabetics just from 2 tablespoons of vinegar at bedtime. And you can also measure the response curve of vinegar on blood insulin effect. A guy named Dr. Osman tested different doses of vinegar on a test meal of white bread or 50 grams of carbohydrate, and found that higher doses of vinegar can progressively lower the insulin response of white bread. So importantly, the dose of carbohydrates in all those studies were pretty much the same. So the vinegar is not necessarily replacing carbohydrate calories, but actually seems to exert a protective effect on the serum insulin response, as well as the blood sugar response. And then if you measure the feeling of fullness, you can measure that in response to white bread and then various doses of vinegar. So the lowest satiety score was white bread alone, meaning you didn't get full. And then there was a progressive linear relationship between feeling full and the amount of vinegar ingested. So another study showed that vinegar ingestion resulted in a slightly lower caloric intake later in the day by about 275 calories less, 200 to 275 calories less food eaten later in the day. Okay, this effect also was noted for products that contain peanuts. And so interestingly, peanuts also resulted in a reduction of glycemic index by 55%. So drinking a little vinegar and eating a handful of peanuts with your meal before you eat your meal will reduce the glycemic and insulin index from that meal, even if you're eating carbohydrates. So how does it do it? So vinegar is acetic acid. How does it get those beneficial effects? So there is, of course, where the fight starts. So it's postulated that the acid interferes with digestion of starch. It's possible it has an inhibitory effect on salivary amylase. and therefore specifically interferes with carbohydrate absorption, which begins in your mouth with that enzyme. The effect on proteins and fats is negligible with pre-meal ingestion of vinegar. Another postulated mechanism is that vinegar reduces gastric emptying, similar to what fiber and protein do. So there's conflicting data about vinegar and gastric emptying. So there's one study showing no effect. There's another study showing a 31% reduction in gastric emptying time. And then ultimately, it's more important to realize that it works, that it does work, rather than questioning how it works. So if you look at those three big studies I keep referencing, the Nurses' Health Study 1 and 2 showed a significant cardiovascular benefit with the use of oil and vinegar dressing. So that was looking at cardiovascular benefit. And so that was seen to be considered to be the effect of dietary alpha-linolenic acid. But mayonnaise, which also has similar amounts of alpha-linolenic acid, does not appear to provide the same cardiac protection as vinegar does. Good morning, Wendy. So maybe the difference is the consumption of vinegar as opposed to mayonnaise. Okay, this is also only an association study, so you can't prove causation, but it's interesting. It's an interesting hypothesis given what else we know about vinegar ingestion. And then what about safety? Is it safe to eat vinegar? Well, a 104-year-old lady from Humansville would say yes, and she mixed it with grape juice and vodka, and I will try to figure out what the fourth component of that was. At one time I remembered, but it's been 20 years probably since I talked to her. So back in 1825, you had a guy warning against the use of vinegar as a weight loss aid and the dangers of vinegar. But you know, vinegar has been around for centuries and thousands of years. So there's just no way that vinegar is not safe for human consumption. Think how many people eat oil and vinegar on their sandwiches, they put it on salad. You just wouldn't expect a rapid weight gain, but it does seem to have some benefit. Using sugar prior to a meal to reduce glycemic index and insulin index may not help decrease weight, might help a little, but the important thing is decreasing that insulin index and potentially slowing gastric emptying time. So if you add that to the hormonal theory of obesity, we can see there's a number of dietary changes that we've been talking about that we can make to reduce insulin levels. So none of these are new. The use of fiber and vinegar in managing weight has been discussed for many years. It's a part of a lot of folk remedies. So what we're going to look at in the next class on this series is sugar and fructose. The other thing we're going to do is probably change up some of the parts of this series. And so what I'm thinking about for tomorrow is anybody that comes on here live, and I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to do tomorrow's class, but I'll put it up on Facebook. And anybody that's live, you can put me on the spot. So I'm going to take, so give me a suggestion on what you want to hear about, and I'll just pick one of them. I won't prep it, and we'll just do an on-the-spot. See if we can stump me about something that you want to talk about. And if you stump me, it's going to be maybe a problem. But most of the time, I have something to say. Of course, any of you watching this knows that. So that's a quick 16-minute thing on the health benefits of vinegar and what it can potentially do. Specifically, eat it before meals, and I'll find out. The fourth component of the recipe is what she called it. And of course, there was booze in it, and specifically vodka. And then grape juice has some interesting properties as well. Might do a class on that at some point down the road. So tomorrow, either at 9:30 or maybe 3:30 in the afternoon Central Time, anybody that's live, you can just suggest the topic, and we'll just do it off the cuff, and we'll see what happens. Okay? So have a great day. It's cold here. It's rainy. It's yucky. So I'm going to teach my physiology class on kidneys at 11, and then I'll see you all tomorrow. See you later. Bye. See you, Wendy.